runs parallel.
It's a really beautiful book. And Greg Pardlow is apparently Rowan Ricardo Phillips' hitting partner. And so when he was here in March, we talked about tennis together a little bit. His poems in Digest have, Arthur Ashe and other, now and then a little tennis comes in. So,
gotcha.
Yeah.
You mentioned in a couple of places your poem in there about running is very funny, I think.
Oh.
That's I find that when that can be something that gets me even more interested in like I've read Nick Hornby's book on football.
Oh yeah.
Soccer, but never really been into the sport prior to that. But when you read somebody who can write very, very passionately about a topic that you maybe didn't even have a ton of interest in, you can it can pull you in. And I think that's a great book. Or like Haruki Murakami's book on running.
Yeah, I was thinking of that.
Which of course title taken straight from Raymond Carver. But what I talk about when I talk about running.
Yeah,
that's
when
right.
we talk about love, right?
And that would be the Raymond Carver
Carver
one. Yeah. How did you get into writing poetry? That's kind of a broad question, but what were you for me, I was always a fiction guy. I was always writing stories, and I would I dabbled briefly writing some horrible angsty teenage song lyrics as a 16, 17-year-old, but I was occasionally writing poetry and was then taking workshops in both fiction and poetry, and kind of by virtue of applying to both concentrations and then getting accepted for the poetry one, that's pretty much where I split and have almost exclusively written poetry since that. So I'm always kind of curious how somebody finds that and then makes that essentially their sort of discipline as a writer.
I mean, I think it's, for a lot of us, it's a little bit like what you're describing. I mean, when I was a kid, I was a huge reader, and I have no memory of making any decision about being a writer other than having ambitions, like even, seeing books in the library and thinking like, I'm going to do that or whatever. But it was, I think for me, just obvious that if you need to think hard about something, you do it in writing, because I was just really a total bookworm as a kid. And so I think I understood that I was a writer, and I didn't have a strong sense of genre affinity. Mm-hmm. And I do think that the way we teach puts that sort of in place in some ways, that you take a certain kind of a class and you have to choose a concentration
right.
if you're doing a degree. And I think it can be, well, I think the world is changing. I mean, now there's all this kind of multi-genre, there's this new poetic prose that's very, mm-hmm. It's not like prose poems, of the 20th century. It's its own thing. It's often sort of longer form, but it has many, many qualities of poetry. It's being written by poets, for the most part, like Claudia Rankine or Maggie Nelson, Anne Boyer. And so, the world is changing, but I think that it was a big deal for me at some point to recognize that I had gotten too narrow in my sense of what I was allowed to do in writing, and that was essentially a kind of specialization problem that comes with getting an education and then a career track, right?
Right.
This is how I am defined in the world and hired for my job, and the kind of editing I do for the most part and things like that. And it keeps itself within its own boundaries. And there was a stretch of time in the early 2000s, I guess, or the 2004, 5, 6, 7-ish era where I really felt at a standstill as a poet, and I didn't know how to solve that, how to change as a poet in a productive way. And so I was sort of spinning my wheels, and then I was like, why don't I write a novel? Why don't I do some other thing? Mm-hmm. And when I started working in prose to a degree, I found a whole new way of thinking, and I was so happy that it had occurred to me to try it. In part because I was looking at people like Juliana Baggett, who is both a poet and a novelist, Idra Novi, who's a wonderful poet and has 2 novels that are amazing, and Rebecca Wolf, poet, who also wrote a novel, and just thinking, why should I be such a little tight fist?
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, there's this tendency that that once you start, it's almost like a switch, right? Especially once you hit that concentration, and that's all you're writing for a while, and it's almost it's almost deprogramming to have to, and it can be very therapeutic. At some point, I just started writing just snippets of whatever, and then not trying to pigeon it as one thing or the other,
Yeah.
So did you finish the novel? Or?
I have a full draft of the novel,
Yeah.
and I have an agent, and I have work to do on it that I haven't been able to get back to for quite a while. Actually, I'm hoping this summer I'll be able to go back into it, because I feel very proud of it. I feel that some of the best writing I've ever done is in this book, and I like the people who are in it, and I want it to exist.
All right. Well, that's something to look forward to then. That's something. A novel just always seems so daunting to me, mostly because I hate having to outline something. And in my mind, I've always been a stream of consciousness writer, and the notion of having to try to like plan something or give something a definitive arc, it just like, I'm sure that if I buckled down, I could do it. But I'm also always such a fan of just the short form, and everything that I write ends up being. Yeah, that's one of the things that ended up drawing me to poetry, was the ability to, and it's actually one of the things that I love about great songwriters, lyricists, is their ability to waste no space, and to boil everything down to its essence, and yet have it be very artful and have great playing with language and turn of phrase and all of that, and it's all within such a small space.
It's funny because one of the things I say to my intro poetry students at ASU, who usually in any of those classes, there's a chunk of fiction students who have to take the first level poetry class as part of their concentration. And I look at them and I say, you guys, when you turn in your final manuscript, it's 1.5 inches thick.
Right.
Like, you better not waste any space. Like, you're asking me to read this much. You need to make every word count just as much as a poet does. They only want this much of my time. You want this, And so I think there's something to be said for those skills in fiction. And one of the things that really shocked me when I started working on the novel is that, having written in short forms, in poems, I understood scenes. And I could stop and start. I could move people around. I didn't get that hang up of like, how will we get them to the grocery store? Let's walk out to the car and close the door. I didn't have that trouble. I could just, I had a sense of the shapeliness of the scene and the ways that you create a sense of, tension and climax and closure in a smaller space. Right. So that, that part of writing the novel was much more congenial than I understood to predict. And the thing that was hard, which I think is kind of funny, is that I found that writing in prose was a struggle with sentences in a much more intense way than writing poems. And this is not because I think in poems you don't have to have sentences and anything goes and that's, just floating out there. That's not what I mean. I'm a syntax person, but I found the sentences of the novel, I just felt sort of embattled trying to say exactly what needed to be said, not waste words, keep things moving. It was really kind of, grueling in the way that, like, a good athletic thing is, right?
Yeah.
Like it was difficult. I was spent at the end of whatever space of time I was working on.
That kind of good exhaustion.
Yeah. Which that's true in poetry too. I'm not really raising one. I'm not making that distinction.
No. And I don't intend to do that at all. I find obviously tremendous value in both, but there's definitely, and I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that one of the reasons that I was able to sort of move towards that poetry concentration was that so much of my writing of prose was I hate just doing set dressing of a scene for the sake of taking up word count. I always fall on the side of just boiling it down to, a lot of the time I love my favorite thing, and what I missed with poetry, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of gravitate back towards writing some fiction, is the dialogue.
Uh-huh.
The thing that always interested me most about, and what I read as well, which is why I liked Raymond Carver so much, and why I like Murakami and people who are so adept at exploring, even like Ian McEwan, like exploring the sort of human condition and really capturing, because in literature in all caps, you can very much begin to lose, I think, the passion between people and how people really interact, and all of the subtext, and it's hard to convey that, I think, and people who do it really well, it's just I don't know, always blows me away. But then I think there are people who can do that really well in poetry too.
Yeah, do you know Louise Glick's book Meadowlands?
No, I don't know that one.
It's one of my favorites of hers, and in it, she's using the story of Odysseus and Penelope as a kind of framework base, and so you get these poems that are spoken by those two or Telemachus, but then you also have this contemporary couple who are living in contemporary America and going through a very difficult patch in their marriage, and so they're kind of sparring with each other. And she has these dialogue poems where you can see the difference in speaker because there's an indent for the second speaker, but where they spar. Okay. And it's so well done. I think you'd really like it.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah. I have tried to do it before to some, like, I don't know, degree of like using one side of the page versus the other, and that sort of thing, and you can do it. It's just it seems like sometimes people are, and I think that this might be where where I will talk to people who don't like poetry, because it just seems like they haven't. They just have either only read what they were assigned or something like that, and some sort of classic thing that has no bearing on their life and has no relevance to them. And like, there's just so much out there. Yeah. There's such a wide variety of, you can find somebody for you. Yes. And like one of the things that pulled me in to poetry was the film Hannah and Her Sisters, when I think it's the Michael Caine character is using E. Cummings poetry to kind of that line, no one, not even the rain, has such small hands. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I went to the bookshelf and grabbed my mom's E. Cummings anthology and started like reading that. And that's kind of from there is where I sort of got into reading poetry. And what for and then I would just like find in music too, Leonard Cohen is a great gateway songwriter to